The world has seen many wars, and will no doubt see many more. One can win a battle and lose the war, or lose a battle and win the war. But there are battles that mean a lot more than winning a war, as if by divine ordination they decide the fate of entire nations, sometimes of whole continents. After such battles, nations and continents can never be the same again. Some battles attract only marginal attention. They do not inspire mass emotional outpourings in the way significant historical events do. They are either not bloody enough or lack the glamour associated with famed military leaders and royalty. Occasionally, through such unremarkable encounters, may decide the outcome of entire wars or the conditions of peace. One such encounter was the Battle of Arabakonak Pass in the winter of 1877. It was in no small measure the reason for the conclusion of a treaty that kept the peace in Europe for 40 years. Mid-19th century Russia was decisively beaten by a coalition between the Ottoman Empire and its major European allies. In 1856, Emperor Alexander II was forced to agree to humiliating terms. Russian patronage over the Christian subjects of the High Porte was rescinded, a right the Orthodox great power had enjoyed since the days of Catherine the Great. Britain, France, and Austria took it upon themselves to defend the Ottomans by force of arms should Russia break the treaty and attack the port. St. Petersburg spent the better part of the next 2 decades trying to compensate for this setback. An opportune moment arrived only in 1876, when rebellion broke out in Bulgaria, whose Christian population followed the lead of their Bosnian co-religionists a year earlier and rose only to be crushed in the most violent manner. Shortly afterwards, Serbia and Montenegro declared war on the Ottomans, hoping to relieve the plight of their Bosnian brothers. The High Porte drowned this particular insurgency in rivers of blood and went on to defeat the Serbs as well. A wave of indignation at the Turks' savagery swept across Europe. British and French public opinion was scandalized and forced their respective governments to deny the Ottomans' support. At the same time, 2 successive coups d'etat took place in Istanbul. 2 reigning sultans were removed. In December of 1876, an ambassadors' conference of the great powers was called in the Ottoman capital. Grand Vizier Midhat Pasha refused all offers for a peaceful solution to the conflict. Russia declared itself no longer bound by the limitations imposed on it in the aftermath of the Crimean War. In April 1877, Alexander II declared war on the Ottomans. To Bulgarians, this last great European conflict of the 19th century was a war of liberation. The Russian army broke through the northern, that is, the European, border of the empire. They established a bridgehead at Svistov, a town on the longest Central European river, the Danube. The river has been a cradle of civilization since time immemorial. Russia massed 200,000 troops on the northern side of the river and 100,000 on the opposite side of the Black Sea in the Caucasus. The Russians subjected the Turkish freshwater navy to heavy bombardment. After a number of feint moves and a withering artillery barrage, they disembarked at Svistov and fanned out. There was little resistance. The Russian Imperial Army was divided into 6 formations: the Advance Guard Group, the Western one, the Roschok, Osman Pazar, Karakoy, and the Lower Danube ones. The latter 4 were tasked with canceling out the 73,000-strong East Danubian Ottoman army dislocated between the fortresses of Rusay, Shumen, Varna, and Silistra. The Crown Prince Grand Duke Alexander Alexandrovich personally commanded the Roschok group. The Western one, led by General Nikolai Kredener, was entrusted with preventing the Western Ottoman army, ably commanded by Osman Pasha, from moving east. Another group, commanded by General Yosif Gurko, was to traverse the Danubian plain, cross the Balkan Mountains, and enter Thrace, thus threatening Istanbul. General Kredener managed to hold off the Turks and forced Osman Pasha to hole up in Pleven. The East Danubian Ottoman army too relied on a number of good fortifications and preferred a defensive tactic. General Gurko, as head of the advance guard, moved swiftly in fulfillment of his goals. He liberated Turnovo and Kazanluk, secured the Shipka and Hainboaz mountain passes, and took Stara Zagora. Around 7,000 Bulgarian volunteers marched with him, highly motivated men, ready to lay down their lives for the liberation of their homeland. Initially, everything went the Russians' way. Gurko carried out a brilliant blitzkrieg campaign. 3 months after the onset of hostilities, the Russian Imperial Army was 350 kilometers from Istanbul. The Ottoman forces to the north of the Balkan Mountain were effectively blocked and could not intervene. The Ottoman High Command took urgent measures. A new army group, Orhaniye, was hastily assembled near Sofia, and a 40,000-strong corps commanded by Suleiman Pasha was moved by sea from Albania to the Thracian port of Dedeyagac. Suleiman Pasha succeeded in ejecting the Russians from Stara Zagora and threw them back to the Balkan mountain passes, where they dug in. The Central Army attacked them at the Shipka Pass. 30,000 Ottoman troops faced 7,500 Russian and Bulgarian soldiers. The defenders held out against improbable odds for 5 days. Eventually, they were relieved by reinforcements from the rear, and the Turkish onslaught was contained. Suleiman Pasha's strategic goal was to link up with the Eastern Danubian Army, break the siege of Pleven, and free up Osman Pasha's Western Army troops. Was this designed to succeed, the Russians would lose the war. The Shipka campaign put a spanner in the works of the Turkish command, and the strategic picture became more complicated. Crossing the mountains became the critically important maneuver upon which success or failure hinged. Were the Turks to advance to the north, the Russians would be lost. Were the Russians to establish themselves to the south, Ottoman defeat was all but assured. The mountain became a sort of Rubicon. The southern half of continental Europe contains 3 large mountainous peninsulas: the Iberian, the Apennine, and the Balkan. The latter's easternmost, and between 15th and 19th centuries, was ruled by the Ottoman Empire almost in its entirety. It is bisected by what used to be called the Balkan Mountain and now bears the name Stara Planina, the Old Mountain. The chain runs the entire length of modern-day Bulgaria and divides it into two neat halves along an east-west axis. The mountain rises like a natural Great Wall of China, with an average elevation of 900 meters, some peaks reaching well over 2,000 meters. The mountain has presented a natural obstacle to invaders from the north since deep antiquity, although it is traversable via a number of passes. The western ones are higher up and more difficult to access during wintertime, even today. One of them is Arabakonak, situated near modern-day Botivgrad. The town used to be called Orhanye. It was only in 1866 that a road was constructed to link the Sanjak capital, Sofia, with settlements north of the Balkan chain. The nearby Zlatishki Pass is no less difficult to cross. In practice, making the journey in winter is a heroic deed comparable to Hannibal's crossing of the Alps or Napoleon and Russian General Suvorov's repetition of that deed in the 18th century. Savage peaks, deep ravines, and biting cold present a formidable challenge even to modern-day armies. It was nearby that the invincible Philip of Macedon, father of Alexander the Great, had his Waterloo. His phalanges were defeated by the Thracian Tribali tribe, while attempting to force the Balkan passes via today's town of Etropole. There is a medieval castle, too, called Bojeniski Urvic, small yet judiciously situated and extremely well fortified. Accessible only via the north, it is perched on sheer rock and was one of the last to fall to the victorious Ottomans in the 15th century. These parts are just as impenetrable in the 21st century, save for a couple of latter-day amenities. A paved road was built in neighboring Vitinha in 1934, and a viaduct appeared in 1985 that enabled travelers to cross the mountain regardless of the weather. The Bebresh Viaduct is 700 meters long and 125 meters high, which makes it the tallest road infrastructure project on the Balkan Peninsula. Only after this gigantic engineering project was completed, communications between towns and cities either side of the mountain were made possible and safe. However, conditions during the Battle of Arabakonak were truly harsh. Crossing the pass in winter by an army on the go was deemed out of the question, which is why the Russian feat amazed military specialists the world over. The Arabakonak clash was not just an encounter between troops, but between two colorful and charismatic officers. The invading commander was an ethnic Belarusian aristocrat and experienced professional soldier, Lieutenant General Yosif Vladimirovich Romeyko Gurko. He proved his mettle during the War of 1877 to 1873, though in Europe he had a rather dubious reputation. To Poles, Gurko was a butcher, since he took part in the crushing of the 1863 Warsaw Uprising, and was Governor-General of the city between 1883 and 1894. For his services, he was raised to the highest rank attainable in the Russian Imperial Army, that of Field Marshal General. He lived to a ripe old age, and one of Sofia's main streets bears his name to this day. Facing Gurko was Mehmet Ali Pasha, commander of the Orhaniye Ottoman army. He was a Prussian, born ethnic German, whose real name was Karl de Troyes. Karl ran off at the tender age of 12, made his way to the Ottoman Empire, and adopted Islam. He then chose a career in the military. In 1877, he only had 9 more months to live. Mehmet Ali Pasha would be killed by rebels in Albania, where the Porte would send him to pacify the province. 2 illustrious Turks were his direct descendants, Ali Fuat, one of Kemal Ataturk's closest allies and then opponents, and Nazim Hikmet, the country's greatest 20th century poet. Mehmet Ali Pasha, a convert and able soldier, would remain loyal to the Sultan to the very end. Behind the generals stood their armies, each with its particular strengths and weaknesses. Gurko led the Western Group, tasked with securing the rear of the besieging forces at Pleven. The group numbered 50,000 cavalry corps veterans and fresh reinforcements with 174 guns. The tactical role of that force caused much disagreement in the ranks of the high command. Gurko took his assignment as carte blanche to wage offensive war, whereas Generals Toltoven, Kuropatkin, and others wanted him to remain in place and make sure the Orhaniye Ottoman army never came to Osman Pasha's aid. The Russian commander-in-chief, Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, shared Gurko's view, although he never helped him secure the men and material for the task at hand. Both he and Gurko were cognizant of the possibility that the Orhaniye army might receive reinforcements, which would make it impossible for the Russians to contain it, and the war would be lost. Hence, with the blessing of the Grand Duke, Gurko split his group into 3 detachments. A forward one, commanded by General Victor Dandeville, a main one, commanded by General Count Pavel Shuvalov, and a flying right flank regiment, commanded by General Nikolai Leonov. Solid experience and excellent leadership were supposed to make up for the heterogeneous and dated Russian armory. The troops utilized several incompatible weapon systems. Only 30% had at their disposal the modern Berdana carbines. The rest used the old Berdana 1, Krunka, Karle, and others. Berdana 1 and 2 were US made. Krunka was Austrian, while the Karle was German. Paradoxically, the Russian army had sufficient quantity of the Berdana 2 rifles, but the High Command deemed it wiser to let soldiers use the old and familiar system rather than an advanced modern one they had never seen. Several 100,000 of the new rifles remained in storage. The field guns of the Russians were all cast bronze, with an effective range of only 2,000 meters. Facing the Western detachment was the hastily assembled Orhaniye army, initially numbering 24,500 troops and 38 guns. It quickly grew to 52,000 men and 88 guns. The former were poorly trained reservists, but subsequently they were supplemented with experienced Bosnian veterans. Organizational deficiencies were made up for by excellent equipment. The infantry had Peabody Martini carbines with an effective range of up to 1,200 meters and a rate of fire of 10 shots per minute, the best in their class. They were also US made. The artillery was equipped with the German-made Krupp steel guns in 2 calibers, 75 and 87 millimeters, again the best in their class. The effective range of the Krupp was up to 6,000 meters, 3 times greater than that of the Russian guns. The largest part of the war was fought using American-made weapons. Then, as now, weapons manufacturers had no qualms supplying both sides. Fighting at Pleven was entering its fiercest stage. The Ottoman command wanted to break through the siege at all costs and relieve the embattled Osman Pasha. The Russians wanted exactly the opposite. They were desperate to keep the Orhaniye army of Mehmet Ali Pasha and the central army of Suleiman Pasha away from Pleven, as their joining forces with the defenders would turn the tide of war in the Ottomans' favor. Gurko and Mehmet Ali prepared for a fight to the death. The Ottoman forces ranged along the Balkan ridges in several lines, from Etropole to Pravets, between the villages of Novocene and Litakovo, between the village of Vrachesh and the Arabakonak Pass, and over the Zlatica Valley to Sofia. Their main defenses were built up between the pass and the Shindarnik Peak. A key position was Yildiz Tabiye, a 4-meter-high redoubt with 4 guns and ramparts for infantrymen. It practically rendered Russian artillery guns useless, as they were mainly used for firing grape shot upon infantry lines. To the left of the redoubt stood 6 more, totaling 19 guns. Opposite the Ottoman forces stood the regiments of the Russian Western Group, divided into 3 detachments as they. The situation called for the Ottomans to move aggressively, whereas the Russians were to hold their positions. General Gurko received strict orders from Commander-in-Chief Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich to wait and do nothing until Pleven falls. However, Gurko knew that his positions were poorly fortified and would not withstand a massed Ottoman attack. Intelligence sources indicated Ottoman intentions were to attack in the direction of Pleven. On the 6th of November, 1877, Gurko laid out his plan before Russian HQ. He recommended a thrust towards Orhaniye in order to deal decisively with the growing threat of the eponymous Ottoman Army Group. Then, he favored a march across the mountains and a frontal assault on Sofia. On the 15th of November, 1877, the Western Group left Telish near Pleven and started towards Orhaniye. Gurko sent a cavalry regiment led by General Vladimir Klot to stop the Ottomans' advance towards Pravets. On the 22nd of November, Klot advanced on the village of Litakovo at the head of 4 squadrons. Another squadron and a half, led by Colonel Likhtansky, moved towards the village of Novocene. There, the Russians encountered strong enemy resistance and fell back in disarray. They were followed in retreat by numerous Bulgarian refugees. The Ottomans set the village on fire. The loss proved strategically excusable, as Gurko was able to divert the attention of the enemy and mask his real intentions. The following day, the 23rd of November, the main force of the Western Detachment under the command of General Shuvalov crushed the Ottomans at Pravets and pushed it back towards Orhaniye. Simultaneously, the forward regiment under General Dandeville succeeded in liberating Etropole. The town fell to the Russians on the 24th of November. Parts of the western group started towards Orhaniye. The retreating Ottomans set the town on fire and subjected the populace to terrible violence. The avant-garde Russian troops, led by General Nikolai Elis, entered the town. The Ottomans had pulled out and fortified themselves in redoubts around the hilltops surrounding Orhaniye and were preparing for a decisive battle. On the 2nd of December, Gurko ordered an artillery opening on the Ottoman positions. On the morning of the 3rd of December, the Ottomans attacked the positions manned by the Moscow Royal Guards. They failed due to the Russians' preparedness and their effective use of artillery. The Ottomans were further demoralized by a massive explosion in one of their munitions depots, the result of a direct hit by a Russian shell. After a short pause, however, they recovered enough to renew the attack, focusing on the Guards' right flank. The Russians threw all they had into the battle and managed to push back the enemy, but eventually retreated. The Ottomans attempted a third onslaught, this time towards the left flank of the Guards. The Russian defense held. General Oskar Grippenberg, who was in command of the Elite Guard Regiment, drew out his sword and personally led his troops into a fierce and rather petulant counterattack. It succeeded in fracturing the Ottoman battle order, and with the aid of some reservist marksmen, the enemy was contained and finally thrown back. The following day, the 4th of December, the Turks again tried to break through Russian defenses, but to no avail. Despite the enemy's numerical advantage, the Russians hung on to their positions and denied their adversaries access to the Pleven Road, where the besieged Western Army waited in vain for relief. On the 8th of December, General Gurko and his HQ moved from Etropole to Orhaniye and were met with jubilation by the locals. Astride his white mount, Gurko inspected a makeshift parade in front of the town clock tower and announced the end of Islamic rule and Bulgaria's freedom for all eternity. The failure to hold his position caused Mehmet Pasha to be removed from any positions of influence. He was only in charge for 32 days, long enough to help change the course of history. And he did. At the same time, the Central Ottoman Army, led by Suleiman Pasha, managed to cross the Balkan Mountains in the other direction, via the Svardishki Pass, and defeated the Russians at Atlanta. His victory was a direct threat to the Russian force besieging Pleven, but Suleiman Pasha was uncharacteristically hesitant. Instead of moving west as fast as he could, he lingered for several days. The situation became critical for Osman Pasha at Pleven. He attempted to break the siege, failed, and was wounded in the process. On the 10th of December, 6 days after the Arabakonak battle, the Pleven commander surrendered the city. Suleiman was to find out a few days after the fact. In the meantime, he would try to break through the Russian front and would be repulsed again, with even greater losses. The Ottoman HQ ordered the central and detachments of the Eastern Ottoman armies to pull back into southern Bulgaria. Suleiman Pasha intended to organize the defense of the Balkan passes, believing them to be impassable in winter. Gurko proved him wrong. On Boxing Day, 1877, 20 days after the Arabakonak battle, the main column of the Western Army headed for the pass in exceptionally inclement weather. Field guns were disassembled and carried by hand. Troops slept outside in temperatures of minus 15 degrees centigrade. The local population, townsfolk from Orhaniye and Etropole, villagers from the surrounding area, gave invaluable assistance to the advancing Russian army. They supplied its commanders with detailed information on the movements of Ottoman troops and the weather conditions in the mountains. Injured and frostbitten Russian soldiers were quartered and cared for in the homes of Bulgarians. Emboldened by such overwhelming hospitality and gratitude, the Russians swept aside the Turks at Saransi, and their nemesis at Arabakonak knew he was now encircled. The Turks left their positions without a shot being fired. The Western group advanced inexorably, and on the 4th of January, a mere 10 days after the start of the operation, General Gurko entered Sofia. Thus, he found himself in the rear of Suleiman Pasha, whose army was quartered in Plovdiv. The Turkish commander of Sofia, Osman Nuri Pasha, dared not follow Suleiman's orders to set the city on fire. He retreated in the direction of Pernik instead. The Orhaniye army was finished for good. Suleiman himself was routed near Plovdiv on the 6th of January. The road to Istanbul was thrown wide open. On the 20th of January fell Adrianople, the first Ottoman capital in Europe. The city is a mere 200 kilometers from Istanbul. The reversal of fortune that befell the Ottomans was staggeringly quick. Over the course of 2 months, the Russian armies managed to cross the Balkan Range, destroy 2 of 3 opposing armies, and find themselves within reach of the enemy's capital. The great powers, hitherto mere observers of the titanic struggle between Tsar and Sultan, decided to intervene. They could not allow the Russian emperor to ride his white horse into the ancient city of Constantine any more than they could permit Russian control of the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles. Russia was forced to sign a preliminary peace treaty with the defeated Ottomans. The final solution was postponed. A Great Power Congress was called in Berlin for that purpose. All this was possible because General Gurko overcame spectacular odds at the Battle of Arabakonak and succeeded in crossing the Balkan Range in winter. The paradox of history is that the future of an entire continent was decided during a relatively insignificant military encounter and a feat of heroism that followed it. The Berlin Congress of 1878 proved fateful. The great powers reached a compromise in order to settle their differences and achieve lasting peace in Europe. It was here that Bulgaria was resurrected as an independent state, taking its rightful place on the political map of Europe. The European holdings of the Ottoman Empire shrank considerably. At the Congress, the High Porte was represented by 3 men. One was the apostate Karl de Troyes, now known as Mehmet Ali Pasha, whose run of luck was soon to end. The famous painting by Anton von Werner, The Berlin Congress, depicts all the great European statesmen of the era: Prince von Bismarck, Count Andrasse, Lord Disraeli, Prince Gorchakov, Lord Salisbury, and others. Karl Mehmet is shown hovering in the periphery in an attentive, almost servile manner, virtually invisible. Von Werner's verdict is hard to misinterpret. The apostate, the Arabakonak loser, had no place amongst the great men of the era. The Berlin Congress marked the logical end of a process that started with the Crimean War. The Ottoman Empire was falling apart, and everyone wanted a peace. A long time has passed since then. Old deals no longer hold. The Ottomans are but a memory. The road to their final defeat passed through Arabakonak, and the only mark of this momentous event is a modest memorial high up in the Balkan Mountains. It is a memorial to a battle that changed not merely the course of a war, but of European history as well.